Everybody, Chris Webster here to talk about one of the latest supporters to the Archaeology Podcast Network, the Motley Fool. Now, I've been investing in the stock market through various applications for a few years now, and everybody who's listening to this can benefit from that sort of investment for the long-term financial planning. And also, I know the hosts of these podcasts can benefit because as archaeologists, like none of us get retirement. We all have to kind of fend for ourselves. So investing in the stock market is a good idea, but not everybody can do it. And look, we get it. The market is complicated and confusing, and to many of us, it simply doesn't make sense. In fact, where do you even start? Take all of the guesswork out of it with the Motley Fool Stock Advisor. The Motley Fool has been around for over 25 years and has been spot on in recommending some of the world's most important companies before they hit the big time. I'm talking about Amazon, Tesla, Netflix, Starbucks, all before they exploded in value. With their easy to use and super informative service, Stock Advisor, you could join the ranks before they potentially find the next big thing. After all, their average stock recommendation is up over 400% as of April 10th, 2023. And no need to be intimidated by financial jargon or market complexities. As the name suggests, these guys don't take themselves too seriously. Now, finances, that's a different story. Their friendly and relaxed approach has helped over 700,000 people move closer to financial independence, all while beating the market and having fun. New members can access Stock Advisor for only $89 for their first year, a full $110 off the full list price. Don't sit on the sidelines and think about what could have happened. Visit fool.com/APN to start your investing journey today. That's $110 discount off of $199 per year list price. Membership will renew annually at the then current list price. So again, check the link in the show notes of this episode.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to Tea Break Time Travel, where every month we look at a different archaeological object and take you on a journey into their past. Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Tea Break Time Travel. I am your host, Matilda Siebrecht, and today I'm savouring a pina colada tea. I thought, well, if the weather's going to be acting as if I'm in the tropics, then I may as well drink a cocktail tea to celebrate. And joining me on my tea break today is Ronja Lau, an archaeologist who specialises in ancient textiles. Are you also on tea today, or what are you drinking?
I'm actually not a tea drinker. I'm mostly drinking water all the time, so I have a glass of water next to me.
Fair enough. That's typical. I don't know if you've listened to previous episodes, but the very first episode I recorded was with Ashley from the Candles episode, and she said, I don't drink hot beverages. And I was going, no. But you're similar. Also, no coffee, no hot chocolate?
No, I'm not actually. No, I'm just a water drinker, and it's quite warm in Germany at the moment, so water is really refreshing now.
Fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. And out of curiosity, seeing as you're German, I imagine water has to be with bubbles then?
Yeah, we have like this self-made bubble machine. I don't know. So we are always prepared. Yeah.
I remember being really confused the first time I went to Germany, and I just asked for like a normal water, and they came and it had bubbles in. I was going, what? And that's
we laugh it. It's very good.
It's even if you go into the shops and you look at the water bottles, classic water, like klassisches Wasser, is with bubbles. Like. It's like, no. Classic water is flat. Anyway, one of those standard things. As I mentioned, you are an archaeologist. What first tempted you, should we say, to get into archaeology? How did you start on this path?
Oh yeah, that's a great story actually. Well, for me personally, I didn't know what to do after school, so I was just really thinking about working first, and I started actually with the living history first. So most archaeologists also do living history, and I thought, well, this is such a nice topic. I want to learn more about it. I want to, dive deep, and and then I started to look out for some jobs, and I started working in archaeology first before I started studying it.
Really?
And I was looking I was digging with some, just small excavations in Berlin. And I thought, well, this is also really nice. I like also the practical part and the theoretical part about it. So maybe I will just start studying archaeology. And so I started prehistoric archaeology in Berlin. And I thought, this is really great. I want to do that. And then, of course, you need to specialize to something. And then I thought, well, I'm really good in textiles and sewing and crafting things. So this will be my topic.
No, fair enough. And at the moment, you are doing your PhD, correct?
Yes, I'm a PhD student at the moment. I am at the Ruhr University in Bochum, actually, so I'm still living in Berlin. And I'm also doing my PhD thesis about textiles, Iron Age textiles in
So
Austria.
yeah, it really did grip you if you've managed to go all the way through to PhD level to do it. And I'm curious though, because so you said that you worked in archaeology like as an excavator, but you were able to work even without an archaeology. Did you have to do a particular training, or I'm just curious personally how that works?
Yeah, I mean, I was a bit, just going straight forward to ask them, hey, can I do like an internship? Wanted to have a look at it. And I said, yeah, I mean, you can have an internship for 2 weeks. I mean, we don't pay you anything, but you can see how it goes for you. We teach you some stuff, and that worked pretty well, actually. So I was just asking, can you take me in?
Nice.
And they said, yes.
That's funny, actually. My first ever excavation job was pretty similar in that I basically I had done my undergrad degree, but I had emailed so many people, also in Germany, funnily enough, and everyone was going, oh, no, sorry, no, we don't have work, no. And then, but luckily at some point someone would be like, oh, no, we don't have work, but try this person, they might have work. So then in the next email, I'd be able to be like, so-and-so recommended I contact you, being like, pretending that we were best buddies. And eventually I sort of got through to someone who said, oh, no, we don't have any work, but we have a tour of our excavation this weekend. Do come along and have a look, might be interesting to you. So I went along and basically indeed cornered them and said, please give me a job. And I think just having me physically there in front of them, they couldn't say no. So it's not that we're recommending to any of our listeners that this is the way you should get an archaeology job. You should be respectful and
Sure.
But excellent. If you could travel back in time, after all, this is tea break time travel, where would you go and why?
Yeah, I thought about this question earlier, and I must say, through all the times I want to have a look at the Stone Age, the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, the Middle Ages. So I have a small glimpse into everything, because I'm so curious. As prehistoric archaeologists, the more we go back in time, the less we know about societies and people and stuff, because the finds are getting more sparse and everything. So of course, going back in time very far is probably the most interesting thing about it. Yeah, so Stone Age and Bronze Age would be I think the best.
Fair. So like a tour, like one of these, bus tours where you get off and check each of the things.
It's not a pub crawl, but a time crawl.
Yeah,
I don't know.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, let's face it, if they ever did invent time travel, that's probably, there's bound to be some business that starts doing that. So, okay. Well, hopefully, fingers crossed. Although, of course, they probably haven't invented time travel, because I feel like we'd know about it by now, unfortunately. But okay. So Stone Age, Bronze Age, fair enough. Which is funny because you're doing, I think, Iron Age?
Yes, I'm doing Iron Age at the moment, but of course, as a textile archaeologist, you just get everything that is here. So I'm not really specialized into one time, but of course, as my PhD is dealing with Iron Age textiles and also my master thesis, I'm quite into this time period.
Okay. Well, I think we'll come back to that in later in the podcast, I think, because otherwise we'll spend far too much time fangirling about ancient textiles. So thank you very much for joining my tea break today.
Yeah.
And of course, before we look at today's object, we first indeed have to journey back in time. This time we're going back to around 5000 BC, so kind of halfway on the tour bus, I guess. And unfortunately, our navigation software is a bit broken, so we're not really sure where we are geographically, but it doesn't really matter, actually, for this episode. We do, however, find ourselves in the middle of a small but very busy settlement. There's a huge longhouse, a figure skinning a deer using a flint blade to slice the hide away from the gleaming muscle beneath. Nearby, there's another figure stoking the fire in a wide hearth. Next to them, yet another figure crouches next to a large rock, bent over their task in quiet concentration. We edge our way further forward and see that they're cutting grooves into small sections of what looks like a deer leg bone using a flint blade. Once the groove is halfway through the material, the bone is flipped and a mirroring groove is carved into the other side. When it's almost deep enough that you can see some light from the fire shining through, the figure uses a wedge to split the bone apart into tiny slivers, which are then pierced at one end before being scraped with a fresh tool to create a tiny, sharp point. So today we are looking at sewing needles, not necessarily bone needles specifically, but of course, that is what we see through the majority of the archaeological time period, I can imagine. So we'll get into the details soon. But first, of course, we have to look at the most asked questions on the internet. And there weren't actually that many because, and I had to use bone needle for this because if you just use needle, then all kinds of things come up about modern sewing techniques and everything. So, and even then there weren't actually that many. And they all basically asked the same two questions, which were, first of all, what were bone needles used for? I don't know if you can elaborate on this, Ronja.
Well, that's a broad question.
Yes.
And I mean, I'm into this topic of textile production and stuff. So this question is like, duh. Yeah. I mean, what are bone needles for? Of course, mostly sewing something. But of course, like you said it in your nice surrounding first part, like there is a needle which has a hole at the end. So because, of course, we have other needle types too, which don't have holes at the end. So you have to put a thread through it. So like needles with a hole attached with a thread, they are mostly for sewing, attaching something A, fabric, or something B, something else to another. They can used for embroidery and netting and stitching and something else. So everything that is somehow related with a thread and combining something with each other. So that's the I think that's the very plain answer to
it's a pretty simple answer. Yeah. No, that's nice. We like simple answers. Next one, slightly more. I liked the wording of this one as well. It was always, when was the bone needle invented? Which I like the use of the word invented. Not sure you can provide an answer for this one.
Well, I mean, yes, if something gets invented, so we have to think about a time period where a needle was not used, and then at a certain point it eventually was suddenly, boom, there was a needle. We don't know where it comes from, but there is it. I mean, needles are one of the oldest tools we know of mankind. So I have looked it up actually, and have had a look at what were the earliest evidence of needles we have. So there is this needle from the Siburu cave. It's in Africa, and it's also named as the earliest sewing needle. And it's also made out of bone and was dated 59,000 BCE. So, of course, Africa holds, of course, a lot of very old tools dated very long ago. So this is not an unusual find, actually. So, okay, yeah, some bone needles in Africa sounds very plausible. But then we also have some needles from the Denisova cave. It's in Russia, and it's 50,000 years old. So there are also very old needles we can find here. So where mankind is, I think there are also needles we can also think about. I think this is also a question later with the needles and the sewing and the clothing connected to each other. So when was the first clothing invented? And I think the question, when was the first bone needle invented, goes really well together. So, yeah.
And because indeed you always have this image, like the cartoons and everything of, cavemen, prehistoric man, just with skins draped over them, kind of thing, like half a lion just draped over them sides. But do you, and again, we're probably going to go into this in a bit more detail afterwards, but we have a bit of time now. Do you think that would have been the first kind of clothing, that it would have just been draped over, or do you think indeed it was always sewn from the beginning?
It's not always necessary to sew clothing. So we also have like later, for example, from the Iron Age, later evidence that there are also clothes which are just draped around the body and are fastened with, maybe a belt or with some fibula and stuff. So you don't need to sew clothing. But we have some, if we think about like leather clothing or clothing made out of some other fibers, plant fibers and stuff, which are not really spun, but maybe also like, braided and stuff, and leather sewn to each other, is probably plausible for also Stone Age people. And this gives us a very big, insight about technology and dressing themselves having an idea about how I want to look, how I want to cover myself, what are the reasons for covering ourselves, because I think there was a study which showed that people can survive naked, like around 21-degree temperature outside. So if Stone Age people lived in, of course, in colder climate, they need to cover themselves just to protect themselves from the environment. But also clothing is just not a protection, but also shows our social status, our where we belong to, which is our ethnicity, maybe where we are in our family and surrounding. So just clothing and producing it has always some kind of a meaning behind it, not just a practical reason. And so I also think people may be very conscious about how they create their clothing and spend also time on it because sewing takes time, most of it, but they're willing to do it and to make also really nice clothing and decorating it, embroidering it, sewing some decoration on its shells and muscles and, just making nice clothing, even if they are just for protecting against the environment. We have some evidence from graves from the Stone Age where we have a body laying there, but no clothing because, it's organic material. It's not surviving that long, but we have some evidence of embroidered shells on the body, and they had to be attached onto something. So this was probably part of the clothing, and this also must have been sewn onto the clothing. Yeah.
Which that reminds me a bit of, I remember meeting Teresa Camper. I met her through Exarch. She does a lot of leatherworking. She does a lot of replication of prehistoric leather clothes. Oh, yeah. So sort of early, like Mesolithic and early Neolithic. And indeed, she says a similar thing to what you were just saying, that clothing would not have just been functional. It would have also been beautiful. And so she makes these really gorgeous pieces of clothing. And I think that that's a really interesting idea, because so many times if people even replicate, clothing from the past, like if they're doing living history, it is very simple and it's very crude, and it's, which it wouldn't necessarily have been like that, I guess. No.
Yeah, that's very common misconception about like prehistoric people in general. They need to be dressed really, like I said, crude and simple and not well done, just but that's not the case. And I'm really into telling people we love beautiful stuff. I dress nicely if I want. That's just, that's fine. And people did that also a couple of thousand years ago.
Yeah. And when you do your reenactment, just going briefly back to this, which sort of time periods do you generally focus on? Do you also make your own clothing for that? Do you also have to think of these things when you're making it?
Yes. So I'm doing living history for now 16 years. So I have quite a long time, going through all the time periods.
Wow. Yeah.
I have recreated clothing from, of course, the Iron Age, from Slovenia, from Austria, from the Iron Age in Estonia, from I'm starting now Bronze Age, also from northern Germany now. I have a lot of medieval stuff because we also have some medieval groups here, and I also work in a museum village. So medieval stuff is necessary, but differences from the 11th century, the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th century, I also make. Wow. So I have most of the Middle Ages.
Okay. You'll be all set for your time travel trip. You'll have everything. Yeah.
I hope I don't point out in the time travel she's from the future. No. Right. And you always have to ask yourself, what is my intention? Do I want to hand sew everything by myself? Do I want to plant dye everything by myself? Do I want to hand weave everything by myself? So you have to make some cuts, of course, and don't spend so much money and time on it. But of course, this is what my hobby is, what I love to do at the weekends, and where I put all my passion into it. So I mostly do all of the stuff myself, and if I can't do it because I didn't learn it, I let people do it who can help me with that. For example, dyeing things and stuff. Yeah. So I hope my quality is always pretty high. but I'm also just learning by doing all the time. For example, for the Middle Ages, you see other depictions of people and say, oh, I haven't seen this one. Maybe I have to add this and that, or have to cancel this because we don't have so much evidence. And, it's always work in progress. Living history is never finished.
So, well, which is great. You have a hobby for life.
That's totally fine. Yeah.
Okay, well, we've gone slightly off topic, but as you said, clothing and needles are pretty much kind of hand in hand, so to speak. So it is important to talk about both. And we'll talk about them again in a moment. But for now, we will have a very quick break and we will be back soon. Welcome back. So we know a little bit more about needles and about sort of clothing, but maybe we can talk about it a little bit more, seeing as we have our specialist textile archaeologist Ronja here with us. So we mentioned already that the earliest needles were probably from bone, but you also mentioned that there's a lot of organic material that gets lost. So could they have been made from any other material apart from bone?
Yeah, sure. I mean, bone is eventually one of the most surviving organic finds, but it could be plausible that early may also be out of wood. I don't know, to start like preparing something. And if you don't need to point the needle through something really strong or harsh, maybe wood will also work. Yeah, but the organic stuff, I saw a post, I think a few days ago, where someone was sewing leather shoes, and they used, of course, an awl to make a hole first for sewing it, and then they attached the thread to a boar hair, like the very strong part of the boar.
Like the bristles.
The bristle, yeah, right. The bristle.
Wow.
Yeah, and they attached the thread to it, like splicing end to end, and then they started sewing the shoes with a boar bristle and the thread. So this is the first time I saw this. So that was really interesting because, of course, a bone bristle, it does not have a hole at the end of it where you can push the thread through. So you have to attach it otherwise. But that's a very interesting thing because there are so many different kinds of material you can use. And I know from also other indigenous groups that they may use other animal hair or pointy stuff. For example, I saw also something from, it's in German, Stachelschwein. Do you know? Porcupine. Oh, yeah.
Porcupine.
Yeah, and you could also use those to sew.
The quills or whatever they're called. Yeah. Wow.
So there are very different also local and regional exceptions where you can use other stuff to point something into something and push a thread through. So this is not only necessarily a needle like we would think of it. So yeah, just be creative. And if you don't have a needle, just use something else. Mm-hmm.
Which it goes back to this whole thing, slight tangent here, but because so a friend of mine, colleague friend at Leiden University did her master's thesis on looking at antler, not even antler tools, but random bits of antler that had been from a site that had just been classified as kind of antler, debris, like not tools, just bits of antler offcuts. And she did use wear on them. She did a load of experiments doing various different things and then compared the use wear traces that she saw on those experimental pieces with use wear on the antler and bone bits. And I think for a lot of them, indeed, they were just random bits of antler. They didn't have any signs of use, but quite a lot of them, you could see very clear signs of use. So this idea of like, oh, well, just because it doesn't look like what we think that sort of tool should look like, it's overlooked. And I mean, that's similar in this case then. Like you wouldn't necessarily look at a porcupine needle and quill and be like, oh, that was clearly used for sewing.
Exactly. Yeah, sure. And of course, you said antler is also, because antler and bone are quite similar, but they can also be used as early needles. And if we go from the organic material away, we later have also like metal needles. Of course, it would start with copper and with maybe bronze needles and then later into iron needles.
And they would have started with copper needles, but would they have been still quite strong? I'm just thinking of like copper wire, it's very easy to very malleable, but I guess that wouldn't have been what the needles would have been made of.
I don't know. I haven't tried it with copper needles, but I can also think like I've tried it with bronze needles and when you first start sewing or using them, they will bend very easily.
Okay.
So we tried heating them up so they will get sturdier. Maybe
like
this
what's it called? Annealing, right?
Will work with copper. I don't know. I haven't tried it, but we have some early copper needle finds from Egypt, so they have to be used in some kind of way.
Yeah, okay. And do you know how, you said you've used bronze, so would they have been cast, those needles, or are they like hammered out?
Yeah, that's actually a good question. I mean, if you want to hammer it out, you have to make some kind of a... I don't know, actually. Casting could be a possibility, but a needle is very fine, and the needles we also have from the Iron Age that are made out of iron later, I think they are not cast. So.
Okay, yeah, well, because I was thinking that would be really hard.
I'm thinking about some finds, but no.
And would the early copper and the early bronze needles, so would they have looked like what we think of as a needle?
Yeah. They look very typically like a modern day sewing needle. A bit bigger, of course, because it's very hard to create the hole at the end. But the technique was really nice. They look like needles you can easily sew with. And I also tried some bronze needles which were recreated, and I was sewing with them. Works pretty fine. They're a bit bigger, of course, so you need to be strong to push those through the textiles. Yeah. But it works. It works pretty fine. Yeah.
Okay. So that seems like there hasn't actually been much variation at all in needles. Like they seem pretty universally standard. Do you know if there's any variation in kind of how needles developed in different places, in different regions, in different times?
No, like the problem also with those needles, if they are very fine and also made out of metal, they dissolve very easily. So if they are preserved, they may have, really a big bunch of rust around them, or maybe they're just too fragile, or just dissolve into the earth, because it's not most of the time we have metal objects who are very big, like buckles or fibulas and stuff. So, they preserve quite okay. But the needle is very fine. It's not a lot of material, and they are gone very easily. So it's also very difficult to find them, and then, to identify them as a needle, and then to do research on them. There's not much going on. So I hope in the future that somebody will deal much more about those sewing needles, actually. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah. If anyone's listening in who's interested in doing metal archaeology of metallurgy or anything, then because true, I can imagine they're so small that it would be hard to see them as a needle, especially if they're covered in so much corrosion.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. I mean, the technique gets better, and the needles will get finer. The holes will get smaller, because like this thread will also be smaller. So you need to have smaller needles and stuff. So they get just better, finer and thinner and better and sturdier, for example. Because if you later also use iron, your needle will eventually last longer.
And I get modern needles are from steel. Most of the time, is that correct?
Mostly steel, yeah, sure.
No, that's because I do a lot of sewing, but that's really interesting. And the thread you mentioned there, so because indeed, I imagine that you mentioned already that clothing would not have always needed needles necessarily, because you talked about the fact that some are wrapped, but indeed, you would assume that once a needle is being used, some kind of thread is also being used. What would that thread have looked like?
Well, the sewing threads we know also from the Bronze Age to the Middle Ages, they are mostly plied threads, maybe out of wool or other plant fibers, maybe. Ply because they are more sturdy, they are more stronger. Ply is a thread made out of two single threads. So
right, I was about to ask.
Don't know what a ply is.
What is a ply?
Sure. So if you spin just one fiber or just one thread, it's not sturdy enough. So you combine two of those threads to one, so it will, be stronger. And we will see this very often as a sewing thread. And they can get really, really fine, also since the Bronze Age, like the spinning techniques, they evolve and they get better. And the people who are spinning, all their lives, they're really good at it. It's a very, it's a very nice craft. Yeah. And most of the time, the sewing threads are ply and were used, to combine the clothing and the textiles. Yeah.
And because you're mentioning sort of spinning and the fact they're creating their own thread, I'm just thinking the amount of times that I have like a long off cut when I'm sewing, or if I've pulled too strong and it snaps or something like that. And it's annoying, but it's like, oh, well, I've got this other massive spool of thread that I bought from the craft shop here. It's totally fine. Do you think that the practice of sewing would have been different back then if you'd have had to be really careful about your resources, or do you think it would have been similar?
Yeah, I mean, we eventually, we have to recreate an environment where we have to think about how much time people spend on spinning and creating textiles. So this is not something we can easily say because we don't ask the people, but we find most of the time, top number one archaeological find is always a spindle whorl. And the amount of spindle whorls we find in settlements and in burials is very huge, actually. So it must have been an everyday task to spin thread, either for sewing or for weaving a textile. So of course it is time consuming and it is a very precious resource. But I mean, I am also sewing a long time, so I am very carefully, and if you get better and more conscious about what you do, it doesn't happen so much that you rip a thread and you just okay. But of course, the thought about your resources and also recycling stuff you may not need anymore is more present, I think, in the prehistoric societies than in our society nowadays. So if you have some thread and maybe if it's just a meter or something, you maybe keep it and just don't throw it away and just attach it to somewhere else. And we see it also in textiles if they are recycled, if something will be reused or something others will be attached and, some holes get repaired and stuff with other thread colors and other thread diameters and stuff. So it's always a collection of what people had on their hand as a resource, Yeah. And if the sheep were shaved and you need to have to wait for the wool to grow back, you have to use something else if you don't have anything. Yeah.
Yes, true. And actually, I can contribute something here because I did a lot of research on bone needles from Inuit, though, so I don't really know much about the rest of the world, but from Paleo Inuit, so prehistoric Inuit. And there were some really cool ones in the archaeological collections where you could see that the hole had broken of the needle, but then they just made another one below it, or that the tip had obviously broken off, but then they'd sharpened it to make it so in the end you have a tiny needle because it's really short because it's obviously been resharpened so much. But that goes with what you were saying of just there's a lot more recycling, a lot more reuse of existing materials going on.
Yeah, exactly.
I think it's very interesting. And going back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier as well, and sort of how prehistoric clothing would have looked like, because of course it doesn't really survive that much. So how do we know what it looked like? Do we have a lot of archaeological evidence for it? Is it just a lot of guesswork? Yeah.
Well, yes, of course, as a textile archaeologist, we have to look at every other evidence we have. So, of course, if we are lucky, we have some textile finds or some organic other finds, which is not necessarily a textile, but also leather, the fur or plant fiber finds from somewhere. Of course, all those organic finds need to be preserved in a very special condition, even if it's dry or wet, for example, or if we have some salt, which is my specialty because I'm working on textiles from a salt mine. So if these are, given, those textiles may preserve quite well. But if we don't have them, we have to look at other stuff. For example, like I said, the spindle whorls. If we have textile productions in a settlement or from a burial, some evidence there. If we have traces of imprints in pottery, maybe this is also a good way to identify textiles, because maybe the pottery was formed and put onto a mat, for example, to dry, and then you have sometimes the imprint of some weave or something on the bottom of the pottery. So the very secondary
yeah, that's really cool.
find we have to look at. If we are lucky, we have some figurines maybe which were carved somewhere out of, I don't know, antler or wood or stone, for example, and you can see on the figurines maybe also from the Stone Age some patterns, from on the head or maybe on the body, and if they're just some triangles and stuff, like really broad patterns. But we may think, okay, this might be a hint that the person who carved this figurine thought about clothing and what the clothing may have looked like, or what was it decorated like and stuff. So there are also some hints for clothing. And if we have some pictorial sources also from the Iron Age, some early pictures of people from the Situla art, where we see in metal objects some scenes of a party, and they're handing wine to each other, and then you can see, okay, how are the people dressed, and what can we see if they have something on their head, and maybe some jewelry also is visible, and how long is the clothing, what is the figure like, if it just wrapped into clothing, or if the woman maybe has like a really fine figure and it's maybe wearing a belt. So it's creating an image of the people. So this really helps us to understand how was also the clothing worn for different events. Yeah, that's mostly what we look at, and also other textile tools, not only spindle wheels, but also from warp-weighted looms, like the loom weights also are an evidence for textile productions. Needles, of course, if we find some. So we just try to have a look at all the all the finds, which are
a real puzzle. Really trying to find all the edge pieces and the corners and
exactly. Or also in burials where we have a lot of metal, we may get the chance to see mineralized textiles onto metal objects. If, for example, a belt bucket is getting rusty over the time, the rust may include the textile and preserve it in that way. So if we have some really rich burials, we also look at the metal objects very closely, and don't scrap off the rust. So we can have a look at it. That's mostly all of the evidence we try to find.
Okay. And you've just reminded me of, I remember there being a lot of hype a year or maybe two, I don't know, time seems to fly so quickly these days, of, I think it was Iron Age, might have been Bronze Age, dress that was found, and it was reanalyzed, and it turned out it would have been colourful. You know what I'm talking about? Is that something quite rare? So, I mean, it sounds like it's rare enough to find clothing, but I mean, in terms of also the color and things like that. So how can we find that sort of stuff out?
Sure. I mean, it depends. When we find textiles, most of the time, for example, in Middle Europe, we find them mostly in wet conditions. For example, done in a bog or something. And because of the surrounding soil, it will stain the textile really bad. So if you excavate it, most of those textiles, they look brownish something, so not really fancy actually, and you don't see the actual color with your bare eye. So you have to examine those textiles, and with modern technology, we can quite easily depict what chemical residues are there in the textiles and from which plant they were dyed. So this is now at the moment common when you examine textiles, but if it was a textile excavated a couple years ago, they did not make those analyses. So they reanalyzed it, like you said, and we're seeing, okay, maybe if there is a color hidden, we can only see it by analyzing it. Yeah, but that happens quite a lot actually with the textile finds. We also have some medieval finds here in Berlin, and they all looked also very brownish and stuff. Maybe you can see some yellow and some red, but for example, blue colors and green colors and stuff, they will not survive that long, actually. But you can always most of the time you can analyze
you
them.
heard it here, you can always analyze them. It's always possible. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.
No. Yeah, but that's for those finds. And if we have a look at the salt mine finds, for example, it's quite different here, because the salt preserved those textiles so well that all the colors are visible, and they are in very perfect condition. So I don't have to make up my mind to think, is this brown really brown? I can say, well, yeah, this is brown, because I can see red and blue and green and all the other colors really well.
That's very cool. And that goes, though, back to what we were talking about earlier as well, about this perception of the past, of it just being kind of lots of browns. It's like the whole thing with the marble statues and how they would have actually been painted really bright colors. And it just gives such a different view when you see them all brightly painted, because you're so used to see, you think, oh yes, the elegance and things of the white marble, and then you see them like gaudily painted bright pink. And it's like, but I guess it's similar with these. You sort of think, oh yes, the rustic, close to home, and then actually they're bright green.
Yeah, there's also one of my, science communication goal to show people, what we think people's clothing may have looked like in prehistory, and what I recreate them like on my, evidence, what I research. And it's always like it's so shiny. It's so psychedelic. I don't know if I would wear those color combination in modern times. I said, well, it was fancy back then. People did wear color combinations of bright blue and pink and I don't know, green and stuff. And you say, yeah, it's nice.
Because I guess would it have been a sign of kind of wealth or something? Would it have been that those colors wouldn't have been available? Or
yeah, sure. I mean, clothing and the social status and what we want to express with our clothing was kind of different from prehistoric and historic societies than we are used to now. So you would like to send a message to the people looking at you. Where are you from? What rank are you in your social community, and how wealthy you are, and what's up? Just without talking to the people, like, okay, I can see the guy from 50 meters because he's so brightly dressed. Yeah, so he must be something very special. Yeah.
Sherlock Holmes would have had it easy back then. Yeah, would have known everything.
Exactly.
I do have one slightly unrelated question that I would still like to ask, even though we're running a bit over, but it's fine. So, of course, you have sewing needles, but you also have other kinds of needles that have to do with clothing production, like knitting or crochet, or I believe it's called nail binding. When would that have begun? Would that have been after sewing?
Kind of, maybe.
Okay, good. That's fine.
It's a good question, actually, because all those specialized textile craft, I would say, is very interesting. I was looking at some needles, like with a hole, but they are not so fine, but very broad and thick from the Bronze Age in Estonia when I was having some excavations there. And I had those needles in my hand, and I thought, what are those used for? We are in the Bronze Age in Estonia. It's we don't have knitting at the time. This is not a needle suitable for sewing. If it's making maybe nets, okay, yeah, it's a net needle, could be. But what quilting-wise? And I thought also about nail binding, because nail binding is a very, very old technique to have like a crochet/knitting appearance, but it's way older. And we have some evidence also from Egypt, very old finds, also from the Iron Age and Antique. So it could also have been that nail binding was common in Europe also in that time, Bronze Age and Iron Age. But we have very, very, very small evidence. For knitting is quite new. So I know some archaeological finds also from London and from Germany from the 14th and 15th century. So Middle Ages, this is quite late, but it probably evolved out of null binding and crocheting. So these are just, maybe techniques and evolutions which follow one after another. Yeah, but we can't really say, because like crocheting and null binding are mostly used for smaller textiles. So not for clothing your whole body, but maybe just for mittens or just for socks. Or just for a hat or something. So maybe this kind of technique was evolving, next to sewing techniques and practices. So we don't actually know.
We need to get this, time travel bus sorted so that we can go back and have a look and see, see if it's all sorted out. Okay. Well, I think we're going to have another quick break so that everybody can top up their tea, but not to worry, we will be back soon. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that your teacups are fuller and the biscuit jar is emptier. So, Ronja, of course, we did already introduce you in the first section. We talked a little bit about your research, but maybe we can go into a bit more detail with that because it sounds really fascinating. So your current research, as we mentioned, looks at Iron Age textile finds specifically from salt mines. Can you tell us more?
Yes, I would love to tell you more about those. Right. My PhD is now dealing with Iron Age textiles from the salt mine Dürnberg in Austria, which is south of Salzburg. Maybe some of you may know this area, because right next to the Dürnberg, there's also the salt mine Hallstatt, which is very famous because Hallstatt is also the name of a Iron Age time period, and because of the burials next to the salt mine. It is very famous, and it was also published a few years ago by Carina Grömer. She was dealing with those textiles from the salt mine. And Hallstatt is a bit older because we have earliest textiles from Hallstatt from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age. So this is a very exceptional find place. And a few kilometers away, there's a salt mine Dürnberg, which is a bit later, so middle to late Iron Age. And those excavations were still going on from the last 20 years. And those textiles were building up into boxes in the museum there. And as we are not so many textile archaeologists in the German-speaking countries of Germany and Austria, we had to wait for my master thesis to be finished, so I could start now with my PhD on those textiles. And I'm really thrilled about this because those salt mine textiles, they really give us a huge picture of textile craft, about dyeing and sewing and reusing and recycling textiles, and everything that you can think of I can do with those textiles.
Amazing.
And because we also have like Hallstatt and Dürnberg and some kind of a connection laying next to each other, and also like maybe people left Hallstatt and went to Dürnberg, we also can see a difference in fashion, maybe about how they may change their dyeing techniques from Hallstatt to Dürnberg, because they're just a few hundred years in between them, and just have a really close look at Iron Age textile productions, where we usually just paint a really broad picture of just one big period, but there we can just separate them, early Iron Age and late Iron Age, and then have a look at those great textiles. So that's my task, mostly documenting all the textiles, making nice pictures, making microscopy of those finds, finding out what are the patterns like, what's the weave type like, what's the quality, the fineness of those textiles. So everything that's really just basic, actually, but really necessary to get a good overview about all those textiles. And of course, the question behind this, we also have this small micro region where we have the settlement, so where the people lived, we have the burial right next to it, where the people are buried, and we have the salt mine where the people worked all the time. So just a really small area on top of a mountain where the people lived, and we can also have a look at the textile tools which we find there in the settlements, and we can have also look at the textiles in the burials and maybe compare them with the textiles in the salt mine. Because the question in the salt mine is always, what were those textiles used for. But they are most of the time secondary used as some kind of rags, or maybe some protection for the hands of the people working in the salt mines, just some, I don't know, wipes or something, or if some sleeve got ripped off during work and just trash, and they, throw it in the corner, and it was just, trash. So we also have some difficulties to see what was the actual use of the textile in the first place. But, that doesn't matter actually that much for me, as I just want to show all those bright colors and all those patterns and all this, all the information that we usually don't have in such closed environment.
Yeah. And is it, because I assume these are sort of woven textiles, so are they made from wool or linen or?
Right. So most of the textiles are made out of wool. We also see those in Hallstatt, but the Dürnberg textiles also have a quite amount of linen textiles, which is very unusual, because we thought linen was not so much used in the Iron Age in Austria, because we don't have them so much in Hallstatt. But this, of course, is one point of maybe a change for those societies, that they may have used linen. But the question is, they are living on top of a mountain, so where does the linen come from? They were not able to cultivate it themselves. So, of course, the people living and working in the salt mine were very rich for the time, because they had the salt and they traded the salt for a lot of different things. So maybe also a textile trade was part of the salt trade, actually. But this is also a point which we can most of the time no longer, see, because of the very few amounts of textiles we have. And if they get traded or not, and what are the specialties of those traded textiles, why are textiles traded? If they can, make them themselves, maybe. But if they can't make them themselves, like the linen textiles, maybe they are imported from somewhere else.
Wow, okay. So then I guess that gives ideas as to communication with other societies or other communities. And
exactly.
Interesting. And have you found any needles?
Not that I know of, but I may have a look at the finds myself. Because also in the publications, not always textile people are having a look on those tools, so they may get interpreted differently, or maybe the pictures are misleading. So I will definitely have a look at those finds in the museum by myself, just look through everything. And because this happens quite also with textiles, maybe when they are attached to metal objects, they are not seen as textile,
right?
Because it's just a metal object. So re-evaluating and have a look at everything is always very important.
I definitely agree with that. That's basically all I did for my PhD. So, And so as you mentioned, you're doing your PhD research. You did your master's research on something similar on this topic as well? Or?
Right. I also did my master's on Iron Age textiles, but they were from Slovenia, from Hallstatt period graves. I was examining 3 different sites. Those textiles were stored in Vienna, in the National History Museum Vienna, because these were finds from old excavations from the 19th century.
Oh, wow.
And those excavations were carried out maybe, in a very different way.
Yes.
We would do them now. So there's literally no documentation at all.
Gosh.
And those textiles were transferred from Slovenia to Austria, because it was the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy back then. And so they were in Vienna, and I worked there on those textiles, and also, like you said, re-evaluating everything I see, have a look at all the metal objects, and find some really nice textiles. And even if they are from very old excavations, and even if they were restored in a not so nice way, I could learn so much from them, and I could gain a lot of information and very interesting insights also dealing with whole burial structures and everything. If you would like, I can tell you an example if we have some time left.
Yes, please do.
For example, this is always a thing I want to tell. There was a burial mound, and in those burial mounds, multiple persons were buried. And it's quite common for those Hallstatt period graves that for wealthier people, there was also a horse buried next to them or on top of them, or something close to the buried person. And I was having a very rich burial with a lot of textiles attached to metal objects, and there were a few metal rings, just some rings, flying around in the grave. And attached to those rings was some kind of fur. So I just not only look at the textiles, but also other organic material, for example, fur or leather, of course. And we were examining the fur, and I said, it looks quite like a horse fur. And I was looking through the documentation, and it said that 0.5 meter above the human, a horse was also buried. But those rings were said to be found inside the human burial. So we did some more examinations, and of course the National History Museum Vienna has a lot of also recent zoological finds or zoological apartments. So I was digging.
So you made some new friends.
Digging in the animal hide department underneath, and was searching. Zebra, giraffe. Oh, there are horses. So I was looking at the Przewalski horse hide.
Oh, wow.
And I was taking some samples from those horse hides, from different parts of the horse, from the head, from the back, from the shoulders, from the legs and stuff, because even if it's from the same animal, the hair structure might look different.
Okay, yeah.
So we were examining them under the microscope. We used an electronic microscope for this, and so we compared those with the archaeological finds. And interesting is that the Przewalski horse is a very old horse.
They're the ones with the really sticky up manes, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. So they're very cream color, but black hair, and yeah. And like the structure of the Przewalski horse hair from the head correlated really well with the hair from the metal rings from the find. So what I was thinking about was those horses were also buried like fully dressed, I would say. So they had their harness and maybe the saddle and maybe some other stuff
in their hair or something.
So decorated, because like the horse was like more an accessory or some kind of statue, statues. Symbol for this human, and I thought those could be really well part of the horse harness, which was actually attached to the horse. But those burial mounds, as you may also know, they tend to collapse. There are cavities inside, and if the cavity was built out of wood, maybe it will rot and it will collapse, and parts of the horse may fall into the grave of the human. So this hint of finding horse hair on the metal ring inside the human grave opens us a very plausible picture of how the burial situation may have been. So, that's
just from a little ring.
Just from a little ring with a bit of horse hair attached to it. And I think that's so interesting and so good, and because we don't have so much documentation from those excavations, it's really necessary to look at every small bit we can find.
Yeah. And indeed shows the importance of looking not just at the kind of big important things, but also looking at the small things and looking at sort of reassessing what something could have been. And definitely approve. So as we mentioned, you're now doing a PhD. Now, I was a bit unsure because I saw you mention the other day, congratulations again, that your funding has now come in. So you're a funded PhD now. So were you before working unfunded, or how did that work?
Yeah, I started my PhD in 2020, and we wanted to get funded actually quite fast. But as you all know, in 2020, a pandemic
happened,
may hit us, and so the funding situation also for archaeologists changed rapidly, and funding was not so easily for us anymore. And through the last 3 years, I worked and I just tried to live and survive. And find maybe some time next to it to prepare my PhD. But my research, it is necessary that I travel to Austria and have a look at the textiles by myself. So having the time and the money to travel to Austria back and forth was not something I could achieve with funding myself. So for these kind of projects, if you need to travel and if you need to spend some time somewhere else, funding is necessary. It's just the way it is. I have my family here in Berlin. I want to live here. I always come back. That's totally fine. But I was starting to, I think last year, I was starting to send out my, what's it called?
The applications?
The applications, I was sending out the applications to a bunch of, funders, and then I hoped for the best. And of course, archaeology is not that common, so you have a small amount of possibilities. In Germany, it's the way. So I had like 8 or 9 applications, and 1 came back positive.
That's all you need.
That's all you need, but it's a thrill, and it's a roller coaster of emotions, and it's, of course, it always is the question, can I achieve my PhD if I'm not funded? And the answer was always no. Okay. And if I didn't get funding, this would have been the end to it. So you can see on this is such a close call, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Well, congratulations again, then. I mean, that's fantastic.
Thank you. I'm really thankful. So.
No, because it's one of those things I always get questions about, how is the PhD process go and how do you apply for things? And so I try to show different variations. But so I know that some people are able to do research without the funding. But like you say, if you have to travel a lot, I can imagine it's different.
It's also difficult in the European countries, right? Because like in Germany, if you're a PhD student at a university, you're not automatically part of the staff. You don't get a job there.
Oh, okay.
There are very limited job offers, and a lot of PhD students. So this is not something you get just to be a PhD student. But I also thought about going to Estonia again, because I was working in Estonia quite a long time. And so the situation there is quite different. If you're a PhD student, you get just a regular amount of money monthly, and then you can maybe get some funding next to it. So you're not just depending on funding like in Germany, actually.
Yeah, okay. Because indeed in the Netherlands, it's the same generally. Of course, with my contract, it was different. But generally, if you manage to get a PhD position at a university which has something associated with it, then you're treated as an employee kind of thing. So it's sort of as part of it. But then also there's external funding agencies, but then I know a lot of people who have also just got the PhD position, but then they're almost like a guest researcher, if that makes sense. So then they don't have funding, unfortunately. But anyway, I thought it was just interesting to show I always try to show the variation that different jobs can take in archaeology and how it works. So I think your path where you've got has definitely been a lot of work, it sounds like, but hopefully it pays off.
I hope so too. Yeah.
And so part of that work was working at an open air museum. You mentioned before, so sort of living history and all that kind of thing. So what were you? Am I right in thinking you were quite managerial? Like you did something quite an intense job there? No.
well, yes. I work or we have a museum village here in Berlin. It's called Düppel, so open air museum Düppel, which is a recreated medieval village in the southern part of Berlin, and is part of our city history and heritage and stuff. So this is actually quite nice. Also to visit the village, and we exist for quite a long time. So the museum was founded in 1975, and it was first only an association, and all the people working there were doing the work for free, just as their hobby, and want to show the Berlin people what their history was like. So in the past few years, the situation changed a bit. We are now attached to the Stadtmuseum, so the city museum of Berlin, and they manage all the public outreach and all the guides who are having tours through the museum and stuff. And the association is still existing and is mostly doing living history on the weekends to show people what it is like to work and live in the Middle Ages, because we have some houses and we have gardens and we have fields, and we can show the visitors what medieval life would have looked like. So I started there also in 2020, and I am now the chairwoman of this association. Also for the next 2 years. So I also just volunteer in this museum and try to live my craft and do all the living history stuff I want to do, but also manage to give some scientific input and to also work to be better and have some more historical accuracy when dealing with living history and stuff, because of if you're just doing it just for fun outside of a museum, you may have your own standards. But I think if you're doing this in a museum and people are paying for it, your historical accuracy should be quite a high standard. So I'm working to achieve this over the time.
Hopefully. Well, and it makes it more fun as well, right? Because you can really talk about the history of it and the archaeology of it, and it makes it a bit more. I mean, maybe I'm biased.
and the Middle Ages are quite effective if you want to research them. So if I'm coming back from my Iron Age textiles and say, oh no, I have no source, I go into the medieval times and it's so easy, I just have to look at some pictures and everything's there. So it's so motivating.
I can imagine. No, but it sounds like good fun. Sounds like you have a lot of different cool projects going on. And so my final question was, for anyone who's listening in who might be thinking, textile archaeology, that sounds, kind of fun, kind of cool. Would you have any advice or suggestions for people who might be interested in going down that path?
Oh, yes. We need textile archaeologists. They are very needed because I said earlier, we're just a few people in Germany, just a few people all of Europe. And I think what I love about this specialty is that we are all so connected to each other. We all know each other, so we see us at conferences and workshops, and we are all connected through different small projects. But this is also very needed because textile archaeology is quite the new specialty. We need to do some basic research. We have to figure out what methods are working and which are not. So we are not just like just basic methods I can, put on those textiles. No, it's always something new. You have always new work to do, and to connect and to talk to each other and to evaluate if this is all working out is very, very important. So if you're into textile archaeology, don't hide. Please come out.
Come into the light.
Get in touch with any of those people. This is there are small hierarchies. I love that we are also a lot of women there, so we have to tell it like it is, and it's a very nice working atmosphere if we're meeting each other. And it's a great topic. We all have a lot of passion for what we do, and we all know it's very hard to work on textile archaeology because it is not seen at the moment in the different parts of archaeology. If you want to work somewhere, they say textile archaeology, what? We don't need that. And I always say, well, we actually need that because textiles come up every week.
Yeah.
And the colleagues don't know what to do with them. That's totally fine because, they have other specialties. Yeah, but we need to work.
Bring a specialist. Yeah.
Yeah, to be seen, actually, to be heard.
Yeah.
So, if you want to learn textile archaeology, please do it. The universities do most of the time do not teach textile archaeology. So my way was also to find a textile archaeologist, which was Carina Krömer, and to learn everything from her. Yeah. So this is most of the time the way to go until we infiltrate the university to teach textile archaeology. Yeah, that's the goal,
Well, it sounds like you've got a lot to get going on with then, if you're, starting a rebellion. So I think that marks the end of our tea break. Probably time to go back to work. Thank you so much for joining me today, Ronja. It was really interesting to speak to you and to learn all about your research.
Thank you too.
And if anyone wants to find out more about Ronja's work or about needles, prehistoric clothing, other clothing, do check the show notes on the podcast homepage. I will put all of our information on there. I hope that you enjoyed our journey today. If you want to help support this show and all of the other amazing series that form the Archaeology Podcast Network, you can become a member. You will be helping us to create even more amazing content, such as this wonderful episode, and we'll also have exclusive access to ad-free episodes and bonus content like our quarterly online seminars looking at different topics within archaeology. Our latest one looked at maritime archaeology, for example. For more information, check out the homepage at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. I hope that you enjoyed our journey today. If you did, make sure to like, follow, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and I'll see you next month for another episode of Tea Break Time Travel.
This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Cultural Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster, Rachel Roden.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.